we can't lay this to rest before the record is actually found, for the sake of the families left behind.
One of aviation's greatest mysteries could soon be solved with a new
That's
search.
a 10-year mystery that needs to be solved.
7 years after the end of the last organized attempt to find it, the search for Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 is now finally back out.
What has made the Malaysian authorities give the go-ahead for a new search, and how come that the company behind the search seems so confident that they have agreed to do this on a no-find, no-fee basis? But the mystery and tragedy behind the disappearance of Malaysian Airlines flight MH370 transcends almost every type of interest barrier. It all started on the 7th of March of 2014 when Malaysian Airlines flight MH370 departed from Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia for Beijing in China. As the aircraft took off, there were 239 people on board, and it initially climbed normally for its cruising altitude, heading north through Malaysia and then towards Vietnam. But the evidence that we have from the final report, as well as from other studies, is that we are likely looking at some kind of deliberate act by someone on board, someone who then potentially continued performing these actions for several hours after the plane's ultimate disappearance from radar. For example, as MH370 passed a waypoint called Igari, its transponder, which helps air traffic control see and identify the aircraft, was switched off. For about 37 seconds before it disappeared completely, the transponder stopped transmitting altitude information, but was still working. Soon after that, the aircraft performed a really sharp left turn, so sharp that Boeing simulations showed that it must have been done without the autopilot, because the autopilot would not have allowed such a sharp bank angle. You see, that turn was made just after the aircraft had been handed over to a Vietnamese controller who was then never contacted by the aircraft. So because this deviation was made between two countries' air traffic control regions, it actually delayed the detection of the disappearance. On top of that, the sharpness of that left turn also meant that the aircraft avoided Thailand's Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ, which was situated very near that same region. Now, had the aircraft entered into that zone without a valid flight plan, it would have attracted attention from Thailand's military air traffic controllers that would have then been able to track it using primary radar. But with this tight turn, the plane avoided the ADIZ, and if any military controller still would have noticed it, it would have seemed just like another airliner departing and going back, most probably to the airport of departure for some reason, a normal diversion. But the biggest factor pointing towards a deliberate action involves the aircraft satellite communications through a system called Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, or ACARS. Because as the aircraft then flew silently back over Malaysia, a ground station tried to send a routine ACARS message to the aircraft. But this signal was never acknowledged, indicating that the system on board the aircraft wasn't working. The link with the satellite would still take place and would communicate the fact that ACARS wasn't working. And if someone had manually logged off ACARS from the plane's cockpit, well, then that log would also have been registered in the log file. Without any such message, the only way for the signal to go unanswered would be a power failure in the aircraft. That same SATCOM system then woke up again and sent a logon request to the satellite. Well, ACARS can be powered by multiple sources for redundancy, so starving it from electricity isn't actually that straightforward. The Boeing 777 has a primary and a backup generator on each engine, and any of them can power this system. Anyway, so the only way to disable ACARS in this way was for whoever did this to first switch off all of these 4 generators. That would still leave the APU, who can also power ACARS, and in the 777 the APU starts automatically if the generators go offline. In that time, the APU can be stopped from starting if someone manually switches it on and then off again. The ram air turbine, or RAT, which generates enough power for the plane's critical systems like the flight displays, its fly-by-wire controls and its navigation systems. So, as you can see, achieving this blackout would have been very complicated, and also When the aircraft system logged onto the satellite again later, it lacked any valid company and flight IDs, which suggests that someone definitely had manually stepped in and stopped the ACAR system from the cockpit. So the removed flight ID didn't stop the satellite communications system from still establishing a link with the satellites, and that caused messages to come and go forth and back once an hour or so, just to verify that the link was still there. And these connections are usually called handshakes, which I'm sure you've heard of before, and there were 7 of them in total after the aircraft disappeared, with the first and the last of them being what's known as log-on requests to the system. They also allowed the investigators to work out much more information. I'll dig into this deeper in a bit, but some sources are mainly focusing on the advancements in search technology, while others are questioning whether another attempt will yield any real answers at all. Left-leaning Punch newspapers goes more into the emotional weight of the search, while the right-leaning Daily Express emphasizes more sensational language like mystery solved and perfect hiding place. The first search for MH370 began as soon as the aircraft disappeared and initially lasted for nearly 3 long years. It was then finally suspended in January 2017, and by then only 2 small pieces that were believed to come from the aircraft had been found. The only reason those parts were found was because they had been washed ashore in South Africa and on Rodrigues Island in Mauritius, and during the years that then followed, about 30 more items believed to have come from the flight were found in Africa, Madagascar and other areas on the west side of the Indian Ocean. Now, Ocean Infinity, the company that have now just restarted the search for MH370, they first searched for the aircraft between January and June of 2018. Ocean Infinity is a high-tech company that specializes in collecting high-resolution seabed data using a fleet of dedicated vessels along with remote or robotic boats and underwater vehicles. They're energy companies that drill for fossil fuels or install offshore wind turbines, as well as communication companies that lay cables on the seabed. Like back in 2019, Ocean Infinity, for example, used 4 autonomous underwater vehicles, or AUVs, to search for the Stellar Daisy, a South Korean supertanker who sank in bad weather back in 2017. And that search was ultimately successful. By using multiple small vehicles simultaneously searching and mapping the ocean floor, the last time the company searched for MH370 back in 2018, they were initially supposed to cover an area of 25,000 square kilometers, or about 9,650 square miles. They actually ended up covering over 112,000 square kilometers, or 43,240 square miles. That's a bit less than the landmass of the state of New York, or about the size of Bulgaria if you're in Europe. Since then, Ocean Infinity has also been expanding and improving its resources, and that in itself is a pretty good argument. The new contract between Ocean Infinity and Malaysia, who is still responsible for the investigation, reportedly has a duration of 18 months. Enormous areas relatively quickly. Ocean Infinity will get $70 million if they find the aircraft. Also having a lot of financial skin in the game here, since keeping a fleet of ships and remote vehicles in the South Indian Ocean for a year and a half. With that in mind, let's have a closer look at how the search for MH370 in the vastness of the Indian Ocean was conducted the first time around, and what has changed since. Like I probably would have seen in maps, represented as 7 concentric arches drawn at irregular radii. Malaysian Airlines was using an Inmarsat satellite for the ACARS and other satellite communications of its aircraft, and we know the precise time when each of the signals was sent out by the satellite. And we also know how long it normally takes for the aircraft to respond after it receives the signal. And the difference between the expected time of the arrival of the return signal and its actual time of arrival is known as the burst timing offset, or BTO. In the case of the GPS receiver in your phone or other devices, your phone is using similar timing information from 3 or usually many more satellites to draw 3 or more circles on the Earth's surface, and where those circles kind of meet each other, well, that's where you are. So since we know the exact position of the satellite, we can therefore also say that at the precise moment when each handshake was made, well, then the aircraft was somewhere along the corresponding circle or arc. A Boeing 777-200ER, which obviously has some practical real-world limitations on how fast and how far it can fly. So from quite early on in the search, investigators realized that they could narrow down the search quite significantly thanks to these data points. So the focus of the initial investigation turned to the southern side of the arc because there are plenty of radars that could have spotted the aircraft if it had turned to the north instead. In addition to the BTO, there is also something called a burst frequency offset, or BFO, which tells us how the aircraft was moving in relation to the satellite during each handshake, because of a slight change in the frequency of the signal. You can think of this like the noise of an ambulance siren, which seems to get lower in tune as the ambulance drives past you and then away from you. This is called the Doppler effect, and traditional radars use this phenomenon to determine an aircraft's speed. BFO information instead can tell us whether or not the aircraft was climbing or descending during each handshake. But the point is that investigators and others with access to this information have been studying the possible flight paths that the 7 fixed arch handshakes can follow, in order to narrow down the possible search area. I have already mentioned one pilot study, the extremely detailed work by Captain Patrick Lely and Jean-Luc Machan, who dove into the systems and procedures used by Boeing and Malaysian Airlines in order to get the best out of the clues that we already have. While Richard Godfrey, an avionics systems engineer who has constructed a series of studies involving something called the Weak Signal Propagation Reporter, or WHISPER protocol. Now, this is something that was originally started by an astrophysicist, Professor Joseph H. Taylor Jr., who also happened to be a keen amateur radio enthusiast. He developed WHISPER as a way for radio enthusiasts to test how radio transmissions made at different frequencies propagate over very large distances. They encounter an obstacle in their path, which causes anomalies in that signal. And there is data in that database going all the way back to 2008, well before MH370 was lost in 2014. It's certainly true that WHISPER was not developed as a method of tracking aircraft or other flying objects. There are passive radars out there who are actually designed to detect the aircraft using existing radio transmissions in a given region. Has also used it to track other aircrafts with known flight paths, including Boeing 777s. Assume that MH370 followed a more or less straight heading as it made its way down south. And that is a perfectly reasonable assumption to make, since everything else in this flight suggests that whoever was in controls of the aircraft. But Godfrey's WHISPER data shows something different. In his model, the aircraft also travels south, but doesn't move in a straight line at all. The WHISPER data also corresponds well with the 7 handshakes, and near the end of its path, the data suggests that the aircraft briefly flew in what looks like a figure 8 pattern at around the time when it would be running out of fuel. Looking below for ships or any other type of traffic that could pinpoint the touchdown of the aircraft before it disappeared under the waves. Godfrey has also published a newer study comparing his team's estimate of the final resting place of MH370 with 2 new data points taken from the home computer of Captain Zahir Shah, the pilot who was in command of flight MH370. And as it turns out, this line passes straight through the area where Richard's WHISPER data indicated that MH370 made its figure 8s. It would definitely lend some more weight to his investigation. Well, last year, Ocean Infinity proposed a plan for its new search, including effectively 3 different search areas which they plan to start exploring in the fall of 2024. And in December of 2024, it finally looked like things were moving along. And then in February this year, even though their final contract still hadn't been signed, Ocean Infinity started moving its assets into place, and the search then finally resumed on 26th of February. Well, as we're recording this, you can actually follow Ocean Infinity's main vessel, Armada 7806, as it makes its way through the Indian Ocean. And the southern one of these 2 rectangular areas mostly overlaps with a triangle in yellow, which represents the new search zone proposed in the study by Captain Bleley and Marchand. Further north, we see a white jagged area, denoting a smaller search area which corresponds perfectly with Richard Godfrey's study. Is that we needed to restart the search and hopefully bring an end to one of aviation's greatest mysteries once and for all. But the families of the victims of this tragedy will finally get the answers that they have been waiting for 11 long years already.
What do you think about the disappearance of this plane? Please comment and let me know. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you soon!